In the pale grey dawn of June 14th, 1944, a sound ripped the silence behind the hedgerows that even the most seasoned infantryman could not comprehend. What burst from the mist was not the methodical hammering of a familiar heavy gun, but a monstrous, metallic roar that shimmered in the brittle morning air. A staccato shriek so fast it seemed impossible, unnatural, like the inside of a beehive caught in an electrical storm. Corporal Hartwell, crouched in mud slick with dew, blinked hard as the hedges 50 yards ahead were suddenly shredded with a ripple of fire, the leaves and branches evaporating into confetti. Sergeant Bywater's face convulsed in disbelief, jaw slack, as he pressed himself so flat into the earth that its cold grit found the cracks of his teeth. Each man's ribs tremored with the vibration that rode over the ground, not a pulse, but a continuous vibrating dirge that shuddered deep in their marrow, faster and wilder than anything they had been told to fear. Just hours before, they'd huddled by flickering gaslight in a shell-battered Norman barn, trading half-joking predictions about the crack German units rumoured to be waiting for them beyond the Bocage country. The intel said the enemy was short on ammunition, slowing down, failing to adapt to the hedgerow hell. The new men, some only weeks from Kansas, talked about old Maxims and MG-34s, as if these were the worst the Wehrmacht could muster, their knowledge built from battered pamphlets and pale diagrams. Even the officers grumbled that the main shock would be snipers, perhaps tank fire if they were unlucky. The enemy's machine guns were swift, yes, but nothing compared to what an armoured push could deliver. In their packs, they carried the practical confidence of those who believed the enemy's toys would jam or overheat or burn up before the real fight even began. When the first squad crept into the field, the Germans hiding just beyond could see every nervous twitch, every pale knuckle wrapped around a weapon. Feldberg, manning a camouflaged position dug into the bramble, was almost disappointed at how thinly spread the Americans moved, how little cover they truly had. He waited for the signal, as he always did, breathing slow behind the mottled shield of his helmet. Beside him, the machine gun was draped in rags and lined with cold metal magazines. A single squeeze would be the difference between another probing attack and an abject rout. When it came, Feldberg did not flinch. His palm settled over the charging handle of the MG-42, its clicking readiness barely louder than the rustling field mouse 10 feet from his boot. Then, the world changed for those advancing on the other end of the barrel. There was no warning, just the instant transformation of the air itself, sliced into hundreds of flaring lines of tracer, the percussive onslaught of what American GIs would later sputter about as the Buzzsaw, a term that passed from man to man on teeth-chattering lips, as if saying it aloud could make sense of it. The sound hacked through foliage and bone alike, the rate of fire so rapid that it ceased to exist as individual shots. To the Americans, it was a solid wall of noise, a roaring blur with no start and no end. They had trained for the distinct bang, bang, bang of a Browning, for the rhythmic punctuation of enemy fire. Instead, it was as if a sheet of lead had materialized before their eyes, instantaneous and absolute. Men fell, some clutching uselessly at the wounds blooming in their thighs or stomachs, without realizing they'd been hit until the pain caught up. Others, brains screaming, wormed backward on bellies, too stunned even to curse. There was no time for shouting orders. Every attempt to coordinate vanished beneath the never-ending shriek. Veterans who'd survived North Africa or Anzio were suddenly as raw as replacements, the rhythm of violence outpacing the body's fight-or-flight circuitry. Lieutenant Morecambe's last thought before his helmet was split from its fittings was that something had changed in the rules of war. Whatever pact existed about speed or fairness had been broken. In the smoke-choked seconds that followed, all his men could do was grip mud and pray for malfunction, the old hope that perhaps the enemy's cold precision would outstrip his own mechanical reliability. But the MG-42 rarely failed. Its barrel ran so hot that the handguard shimmered to the touch, yet it still devoured belts of ammunition with the same speed-crazed efficiency. The weapon's bark was so fast that soldiers behind the first line assumed multiple nests at work. Some claimed 5, even 10 guns, when in truth it might be just one. The shock lay not only in the volume and velocity, but in the psychological violation of expectation. Hartwell, face pressed into the muck behind the slumped figure of a friend, thought not of tactics or training, but of a cheating game, of an adversary who had somehow altered the balance of fear. Men crawled where they might have stood, froze when they should have charged. When their own machine gunners tried to offer covering fire, the return was laughably slow. The customary sense of calculated exchange replaced by a sense of being outmatched from the first moment. Each round fired from the Buzzsaw seemed to stitch the landscape itself with finality. Even after the gun fell silent, the ring stayed behind, filling the ears and tightening the chest. Some men described afterward a tinnitus that did not fade, a constant ghost whine that haunted even as they drifted into exhausted sleep. The battalion's engineers and wire teams fared no better. No man could brave open space to lay timber or detonation cord under the endless strafing. Hopes for counterattack dwindled as each attempt to pinpoint or flank the gun position failed. The Germans, operating in well-coordinated crews, swapped overheated barrels with practiced hands, never exposing more than necessary. Feldberg and his assistant counted casualties only by the density of quiet spots on the American line. They knew without seeing that every burst erased not just men, but morale. Rumour, always a faster and more inventive weapon than truth, sped backward along the lines, gathering force as it moved. By afternoon, men whispered that the Germans had brought in some new secret weapon, a science fiction nightmare, a tool meant not for battle, but for psychological evisceration. Officers were beset with desperate questions. Why did the enemy's guns sound like that? Was it legal? Was it even possible? Some, more shaken than they dared confess, suggested pausing the advance altogether, or swinging wide around hedgerows rather than facing the terror again. Not even stories of the MG-42's overheating, of rare jams or hasty retreats, could soften the impression. It wasn't just a machine gun. It was a breach in everything they thought they understood about the rhythm, the very rules of ground combat. Across the field, in the hours that followed, the strategy changed. Patrols were pulled back, smoke was fired as a shield, mortars launched blindly into the green in hopes of choking off the gun's vantage. Some men, recognizing the sound in future engagements, would drop prone even before the first round landed, reflexes honed not by doctrine, but by animal memory. Military briefings, once confident and meticulous, developed a nervous undertone when approaching machine gun nests. Young officers schooled in fire and movement soon found themselves improvising tumbling sprints, ducking in zigzags, ordering more smoke and covering themselves with grenades because the normal cadence of firefight simply did not apply. When prisoners were taken, they said little. Some revealed the technical secrets, the gun's high cyclic rate, over 1/200 rounds per minute, accomplished with roller-locked precision and quick-change barrels. They said it with weary pride, a craftsman's detachment. Yet the genius of the MG-42, what truly earned it the contempt and fear of its enemies, was not its design, but its effect. It short-circuited the calculus of bravery and professional skill. Even the most orderly American or British or Soviet squad, drilled for months on the geometry of fire, found their mathematics turned to nonsense within seconds. As the campaign wore on, reports filtered up to headquarters. The MG-42's sound became something of a legend, a bogeyman whispered about from dugout to trench. Some American GIs guessed the Germans had electrified their old guns, others that a new doctrine of overlapping fields of fire meant the enemy always outnumbered them. In quiet moments, men assigned to spearhead patrols or machine gun suppression teams might confess, in barely audible voices, that the thing they most dreaded was not a tiger's rumble or the sigh of falling mortar shells, but the first metallic scream from somewhere just out of sight, that moment when all movement must halt and every plan seemed to shatter in vibrating, implacable fear. For the Germans themselves, the buzzsaw became a symbol of control in chaos, a tool that, for a heartbeat, made even the largest Allied pushes falter. Feldberg and his loader, crouched behind their battered shield, learned to anticipate the rhythm of panic, the peculiar silence that meant the enemy had modified their advance, thrown command into confusion, perhaps even granted the defenders a brief advantage. The longer the war dragged, the more the MG-42 was moved, shared between desperate hands in battered villages and snowy forests, its sound echoing from Italy's hills to the scorched fields of the east. In time, countermeasures emerged. Allied forces set their own machine gunners to listen for the buzzsaw's metallic madness, to trace its bark through triangulation, to call in artillery the second it spat its first rounds. But no amount of tactical adaptation could erase the original shock, nor the stories spawned by it. For some, years after the fighting, the memory of the MG-42 remained the moment the war changed tone, a memory carved by fear beyond understanding, an encounter with something not just powerful, but fundamentally unfair. Near dusk, as the day's last thin sun cast mottled light through shell-blackened trees, Hartwell, what remained of him, stared across the churned-up field, gaze pinned to the dark geometry of a destroyed cowshed, where an enemy gunner had finally abandoned his post. Here, in the hush that followed the violence, only the low chirp of a hidden bird defied the lingering cadence of terror. In this dwindling light, silence rested uneasily upon the earth, a silence that every survivor would hear